Hello and welcome to this brief presentation on running power. I hope to convey to you not only what the concept of power is for runners, but also why it is important both from a performance as well as a physiological perspective. But before starting, many people might be asking the question to their head, are runners even powerful? For example, if you consider these athletes, the older gentleman on the far left, the woman on the far right, you might describe them as having lots of endurance or lots of stamina, but you wouldn't necessarily look at them and their physiques and describe them as powerful athletes. Similarly with the sprinters, you might describe them as being, really fast, quick, maybe explosive coming out of the blocks, but power isn't necessarily the first word that pops into people's mind when speaking about running. In point of fact, however, all of these runners' performance depends upon how much power they can generate for the duration of their chosen event. So while it's a concept that is intimately familiar to cyclists, where cycling power has been used and measured in laboratory settings for well over 100 years, and in the field for the last 20 years or so, it's equally applicable to runners. It's just not something that's as familiar to them. So hopefully we can address some of those considerations. So what is power? Well, from Sir Isaac Newton perspective, it's a physical term here where lots of different ways it can be calculated, but the relevant one here is to think of power as the rate at which you can do work over time, and work is force times distance. So if you then plug in the force times distance for work into the power equation and do a little rearranging, another expression of power is the product of force and velocity. And that's the one that's easiest to relate to in the context of measuring running power. So how do you measure force and then calculate power while running? Well, historically, it's been done using what's called a force plate in a laboratory setting, which is nothing but a rigid piece of flooring with strain gauges to measure the forces in all three directions that are created as someone runs across it. And you see a typical tracing of force plate data on the left-hand side of the panel, where you have the vertical force shown in blue, the horizontal force shown in orange, and then not shown there are also lateral forces as we tend to rock or move a little side to side, but those don't really contribute much to the power demands or to our ability to run, so they aren't shown here. Now, running by definition is your feet leave the ground in between each or during each stride. So the places in that graph where both the vertical and the horizontal or forward force are at zero would be considered the flight phase, and the places where you do have positive vertical force and initially backwards and then forwards horizontal force would be the stance phase. And the stance phase could then also be subdivided, and some people have described the initial impact as the crash phase, and that would be the point at which the orange curve labeled as a forward force is actually negative. There's initially some braking action when your foot first strikes the ground, and then you drive off that foot and push yourself forwards as well as upwards and go on from there. So by looking at these sorts of force tracings on a force plate, having somebody running across a path inside a laboratory or on a treadmill in which it's instrumented underneath the bed of the treadmill, it's possible to take these forces and use the definition I showed you previously and calculate running power. It hasn't been done extensively in the scientific literature. It's more common to talk about the oxygen cost of running at a particular speed, but nonetheless it's been around. Earliest attempt was probably in the 1930s. Well, the Stryd device uses accelerometers rather than strain gauges, and it's mounted at or near your center of mass rather than on the sole of your foot. So the tracing from the Stryd accelerometer data, as shown on the right, looks similar to, but not identical to, that you see in terms of the ground reaction forces. Nonetheless, from these accelerometry data, it is possible to estimate or recreate the ground reaction forces, as well as to integrate the accelerations to determine velocities and calculate power as I described in the previous slide. Well, if power that we have to generate in order to launch ourselves into the air with each stride. There is also a forward power, the power that we use to push ourselves forward, which then has to be regenerated every time after we land and slow down a little bit. And the sum of the two would give you your total power output while running on a flat surface. If you then run up a hill, however, you also have to consider the power that you need to overcome gravity, not within each single stride, but stride over stride. And so for that purposes, the Stryd Pioneer also has a barometric pressure sensor, so it knows when you're going uphill or going downhill. It also knows when you're going uphill or going downhill, and can add into that the power required to change your elevation. Labeled here as climbing power. So we now have a device that allows people to go out and run around in the real world and measure their power output. And this is really an exciting new time in that we haven't had this data available previously outside of a laboratory setting. So in many regards, the whole story that has evolved in cycling over the last 2 decades is now starting up again in respect to running. And the importance of power is that it can give you some insight into the determinants of a runner's performance beyond what a stopwatch, for example, could do. In particular, knowledge about your VO2 max, your lactate threshold, and then your actual efficiency or effectiveness of running. Thus, the reason it's important to know somebody's power. It influences your physiological responses here. As this slide illustrates, with increasing speed, the power requirement increases almost linearly, but the metabolic response is nonlinear. So eventually you reach a point at which you exceed the ability to produce energy or to match aerobic energy production to aerobic energy demand within your muscles. Lactate levels begin to rise, glycogenolysis accelerates, and the time at which you can sustain that particular intensity decreases in a nonlinear manner. This can be described in terms of blood lactate responses, or you can actually use just field test data and a mathematical model, the simplest one of which is the classic critical power model, to calculate this breakpoint, and then use that to provide greater understanding of changes in somebody's fitness, to organize training around, etc. Knowing your power output especially gives you information about your overall metabolic rate. And here's an example of an individual running at different speeds on a treadmill with their oxygen consumption being measured. And you can see every time the speed goes up, the power requirement increases, the oxygen consumption then has to increase as well. Although you note how power precedes the orange lines reach the new plateau each stage before the VO2 does. So VO2 is always lagging behind the actual demands created by your muscles measured here in terms of power output. Similarly, this is one of the advantages of measuring power compared to measuring heart rate, for example, in that heart rate will also lag behind. Now you might look at this curve and you say, well, if VO2 and power, at least at some kind of steady state, parallel each other so closely, and we know that VO2 tends to is closely linearly related to your speed or your pace while running, why not just look at pace? Well, again, this is one of the advantages of measuring power, in that measuring pace in real time with a foot pod, for example, or a GPS can be problematic. And it also doesn't account for changes in elevation. Power, on the other hand, is a near instantaneous measure of the changes in your effort, and it also varies as you're going uphill and downhill. So it gives you a better real-time feedback in terms of the actual physiological demands that you're placing upon yourself. And finally, back to the relationship between power and speed, and even thinking back to the slide, the picture of the 4 different runners that I introduced this talk with. Power, again, is what ultimately contributes to the speed at which you can run. The more power that you can produce, all else being equal, the faster you'll be able to go. So at the end of the day, your training is organized around, being able to run faster. But one of the components of that is being able to either generate more power in the right direction while sprinting, for example, or to sustain the same power for a longer period of time. Be able to stretch your half marathon speed out to a full marathon, for example. So hopefully I've given you some ideas here as to what is running power, and also why it can be used in a beneficial manner to structure one's running training, to quantify training intensity and make sure that you're targeting the physiological responses that you wish to be targeting, to give you insight into changes in your running form, and hence efficiency / economy / what I've called effectiveness. And finally, the one aspect that I didn't mention, but a lot of people are in early days here are already finding great benefits, and that is for pacing purposes, in particular under varying conditions, such as trail running, where you're going uphill and varying surfaces, etc. And with that, I will thank you for your attention. Look forward to providing more ideas on how to utilize your Stryd Pioneer.